The title of the paper is When the Weakest Link is Strong, Secure Collaboration in the Case of the Panama Papers. So we all know that failure is a really common theme in computer security. We mostly talk about things that break, that don't work correctly. It happens in academia. We see it in academia. We see it in the wild. And we also know that users are often implicated in this, right? There's a very common refrain of users being the weakest link in the security chain. And again, we see examples of this in academic investigations as well as kind of real-world situations. So what we were interested in learning is sort of how we transform this narrative. And there's some preliminary work on this as well. We wanted to understand, instead of examining where things went wrong, look at where they went right and see what we could learn from that about building stronger systems. And so we were able to find this case, but we actually found it in a pretty unlikely place. So we didn't find it in a large organization that has a huge security team and a really kind of tight network infrastructure where everyone is co-located. We actually found it in the Panama Papers. The Panama Papers, for those of you who might be more focused on recent news these days, was a year-long investigation of a set of documents that was leaked from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca. And it resulted in April of 2016 in this kind of large publication effort by a whole lot of media organizations that have been doing basically for a year, have been doing investigations of people mentioned in these papers. Many of them were politicians, leaders of government, companies, et cetera. And so what was fascinating is that this is really not what you would expect from this group necessarily. They were dealing with almost 400 journalists by the end of the investigation that came from dozens of different countries around the world. There were over 120 news organizations involved, so think about all the different infrastructures that are at play there. And they were also dealing with a massive quantity of data. It was more than 2.5 terabytes of data. So just a point of comparison, the Snowden documents was 60 gigs. So a really huge quantity of data, also in dozens of different formats in this case. And the coordinating group here was the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ. So to do this work, we're a team of journalism, computer security, and human factors experts. And we reached out to ICIJ, and we were able to collaborate with them really closely on this work. And so that let us do in-depth interviews with all of the ICIJ team members who had kind of a hand in the systems that were used over the course of this project. So that includes editorial leaders as well as the technologists who built and customized the systems. And that was actually just 5 people. Again, we're talking about an organization of 12. And we also, they also made available to us survey responses from from a survey they had conducted of the participating journalists in the Panama Papers about 5 months after publication. So they'd asked them a whole lot of questions about their systems and what they thought of them, which is kind of a clue. So they got all this feedback from them, and they did ask explicitly, in many cases, about security issues, and they shared those results with us. So that's representing, that sample is about a third of all of the people who had participated by the publication date. So what we know from this, we know a few things. So the key thing for us here is that we know that they met their security goals to the best of their knowledge and to ours, and they had some very specific goals in mind. One, which is that they wanted to protect the source of the data. Up till now, and this is a year plus later, they don't believe that the source has ever been compromised. There's been no sort of public indication that the source has been compromised, in other words, revealing who provided this data. They also really needed to maintain control of the documents and prevent their early disclosure. So one of the responsibilities they felt to the source who had brought them this data was that making sure that no one else could walk away with it, right? They had gone to a lot of trouble to bring it to ICIJ. They wanted to make sure that it stayed under their control. Likewise, they wanted to prevent the early disclosure of the documents, so leaking to other newsrooms, things like that. They also needed to maintain access to the documents. So again, keeping in mind we're talking about a massive quantity of data here, collaborators can only conduct the investigations as long as they can actually access the material. And we'll see how that kind of plays into some of their design choices in a moment. They also needed to keep the project secret. So they needed to do this for a couple of reasons. One is that it was an impact factor. So their experience in the past, ICIJ has coordinated similar styles of leak investigations, although this was the largest, in the past. And they found that they really got that the results of the investigations were much more impactful when they were released all at once, right? So rather than kind of dribbling things out over time, they wanted to start with a big kind of splash. The other thing is that, quite simply, they were investigating really powerful people and entities, and those entities certainly had many ways in which they could retaliate against these journalists if they discovered before publication that they were investigating them. So, as our keynote speaker shared yesterday, journalists are under very real threats in, frankly, most of the world, and that can include anything from, physical attacks. Unfortunately, it also can extend to friends and family members who are under threat from this. So keeping the project secret was a pretty important thing. What we don't know, of course, is we can't say definitively that there was no compromise. That's just not possible. And we also know that these systems aren't perfect, right? So there are things that could probably have been improved at the time. We know certainly things change. And that because of that, seeking expert advice, which is something that ICIJ did throughout their process, in following best practices, is always going to be important in trying to maintain a secure communications model. And threats and capacities will change, and I will say that ICIJ has remained active in this. I think that's another kind of key feature of it. So just to give you a background on the collaboration systems, and just to say here that all of the images you will be seeing have been previously shared by ICIJ. There's no revelation here or sensitive information being revealed. They had three principal systems. One was called the Blacklight Document Search Platform, and that was an open source interface to their backend databases that allowed people to basically search the documents that they had. They had something they called the Global iHub Forum, which was essentially a forum and social network. It was adapted from open source social network software called Oxwall, and this is where a lot of the collaboration took place. And finally, they had the Linkurious network visualization software. And what this did is it provided kind of networking graphs based on entity extraction from the data. So allowing the journalists to kind of see relationships among entities in the data. This was actually executed in close collaboration with Linkurious. Linkurious is commercial software, but they developed a unique instance for ICIJ in this case. So about the threat model. They weren't concerned about kind of entire governments. So even though they knew that there were high-level politicians and things like that implicated in some of their findings, they weren't because most of it had to do with kind of like corruption and financial malfeasance was a big part of this. Their sense was that the intelligence agencies of those governments were unlikely that those people were unlikely to be able to send the intelligence agencies after them. But also there were companies, right, whose activities were revealed in the process of this. Other newsrooms, so this was a relatively exclusive process in that not every newsroom was a part of it, not every major news organization was a part of it. And so obviously the last thing you want to do is get scooped by another newsroom. And of course criminals, lots of criminal activity being revealed, so any and all of the above. So some notes about the system design. They centralized the data and documents, and this was partly, this is basically about scale and control. So again, huge quantity of documents, just can't move it safely, easily, et cetera. It was also, again, that control requirement. They were able to monitor and kind of set thresholds on how much an individual could download each day so that they could see what was happening on the system and be reasonably assured that, again, they weren't going to lose control of the bulk of the documents. The systems also relied unsurprisingly, on well-tested HTTPS. So kind of obvious to do a secure connection, but they definitely made use of kind of open source auditing tools to try to test that their configurations were correct. So we all know that configuration errors are often an issue in secure systems. They made strong efforts to address that. They did consider some approaches that may be familiar to folks in this room, like cryptDB. They did not end up pursuing it, and it was kind of a combination of factors. One was that they weren't sure how efficient that would be for their use case. I think the other one was that they were a little concerned about the maturity and support for the system. So they're a small organization. They don't necessarily have they want to make sure that any system that they deploy is going to have kind of a support network around it, which is sometimes a challenge with open source systems like this. Finally, an important element here was that they had to keep the system URLs secret, right? And we know that security by obscurity isn't a great model, but in their case, it was kind of the only option they had. They literally couldn't afford to resist a DDoS attack, right? They just didn't have the financial resources to do it. And so the simplest thing to do was to just say, let's make sure that nobody gets these URLs, because if they don't have them, they can't execute that attack. So what we found that was really interesting about the security systems that they used is that at the beginning of this project, 45% of our survey participants reported that they had never used two-factor authentication. 47% had never used PGP, maybe a little less surprising. But basically, this is not, journalists maybe are a little bit more tech savvy than the general public, but they're not, necessarily super users when it comes to technology. And yet by the end of the project, 100% of them were using both two-factor and PGP. These were system requirements for the systems that they were using. And what I think is interesting here, too, is that they didn't kind of just say, OK, we're doing two-factor and X, here's the solution. They actually explored a bunch of different ways. Because, again, remember, they're dealing with a really diverse set of collaborators here, people all over the world, all kinds of connectivity situations, all kinds of hardware and software situations. And so they really kind of tested out a bunch of different approaches. They looked at virtual machines as a second factor, which they ultimately discarded as being too complex for their users. They looked at browser extensions, which they discarded as not being secure enough. And eventually they went for a smartphone app. And although they did have some initial worries that this would be that they would have participants that didn't have smartphones, it turns out that it was a small enough number that they were actually just able to purchase them smartphones to use on the project. Now, obviously, the fact that all these people are using these secure technologies is not so impressive if they're only using these things once a month or once every couple months. They weren't. They were using these systems almost constantly. So we know that in the 3 months prior to publication, 89%, almost 90% of the survey participants were using the global iHub at least weekly. And 64% were using Blacklight. Again, that's the document search platform where they actually get the data. 64% were using it daily. And what's amazing is each of these systems had two-factor authentication required for every single sign-on. Okay, so no trusted devices here. Every single time you sign on to one of these systems, you have to use a two-factor setup. And yet, and this is what's so amazing, is that in the survey, 63% of the survey participants rated security compliance on the easy side of a 7-point Likert scale, right? This wasn't the end of the world to them. They didn't think that this was horrible, right? So how did ICIJ manage to get there, right? This really, really diverse group of users. Well, one of the things that we found is that the folks we spoke to really appreciated the kind of usable, flexible security protocols that helped minimize use, and on the project helped minimize the use of workarounds. So the fact that they even created something like the global iHub that allowed them to communicate and collaborate securely is an indication. And so this is a quote from one of our participants who said, for colleagues who are not that experienced with PGP or Signal or whatever, the iHub is a good way to write secure emails or messages to each other, right? This was a place where they could get together, they could share data, they could share observations, and it didn't require, it gave them an alternative. Also really key here is that it helped them complete core job tasks, right? Their job was to conduct investigations. And so they were asking for high levels of security on systems that were important to these users. And we know that because they actually asked them. And it turns out that 83% found the data tools essential to the work that they were doing, right? This wasn't something that they could live without, essentially. Equally important was the kind of collaboration and community building that happened here. This was an explicit goal of the system designers. They didn't, it wasn't sort of an afterthought to have this collaboration system. Again, it was a really key feature. And they found that actually nearly a third of the people who participated in the survey said that they responded with other organizations. They collaborated with other organizations more than they had ever had before. And the reason why is that they really needed to build trust, a sense of team, and this contributed to this security culture that we think was key in both the adoption and that kind of feeling that it wasn't so hard. So as one ICIJ editor described it, you can't collaborate on email or encrypted email or Signal. You need a real space that feels comfortable and friendly and it's colorful, and the iHub was. You can upload files, you can like a topic, and that simple kind of liking thing also helps reporters bond together and encourage one another. It just helped tremendously with providing a sense of team. So keeping in mind, again, that these are people, some of whom know each other, but most of whom are not, they're not co-located, right? They may be time zones and languages apart. And so, again, we see this reflected in the responses from the survey participants who said, the coordination efforts that ICIJ did were really, really essential. So the idea that there were people in the organizations kind of providing this meta guidance was really valued by the survey participants. And part of that was providing an ongoing emphasis on security. So this is one of the ICIJ folks said, in every editorial note I would write, I would remind contributors about some security measure, how it takes one of us to make a mistake for the whole thing to basically fall to hell, and you would lose an entire year of work, and we would be a joke, basically. Nobody would ever come to us again with any confidential information. So I would remind them so they didn't feel too comfortable and too confident. Now, I think we all know that, you know, the shame game is not a great way to get people to comply, but I think the message that's coming across here is actually different. It's about saying we're all in this together. Security is a key part of what we do, and if we don't do this in the right way, we won't be able to do our work, which is actually the task of doing these investigations. So this all contributes to a kind of normalized security culture that had secure defaults. You know, again, part of this not forcing users to make choice or make unnecessary choices, as one of the participants said, you know, in this project we just routinely encrypted everything that we wrote because we were just used to doing it, and that helped us a lot as a team. That we understood that it's not such a big thing and it's not such a pain in the ass, but you're always on the safe side with it, right? So I think again that idea that that as people grow used to using these technologies in a daily way, it takes the support, right? You can't use PGP by yourself. I mean, you're not going to send an encrypted email to yourself. It's actually a really obvious thing, but you need people who you can use these technologies with, and that's a really key feature, it seems, of both adoption and this sense that, you know, it's actually not so bad. Also, user involvement. There was really strong respect and kind of balance on either side between the technologists and the editorial folks here. One of the most valued system features that was mentioned by the ICIJ folks was batch search, the ability to upload not just one search term, but like a spreadsheet of search terms, because often you had 20 or 30 or 100 things you were looking for. It was suggested by a user, right? That was a feature request that came in from a user, and that open line of communication between the technologists and the users was a really essential part of that, right? The fact that the users knew that they could convey those ideas, that they would be, you know, discussed and, you know, in many cases implemented. And, you know, I think, again, this kind of sums it up, as one of the ICIJ folks said, you know, it's great. It's just software that is designed for journalists, and that's all we care about. The final thing I want to mention is about organizational commitment, right? So I think, again, one of the things we see, and this was ICIJ itself as a small organization, even though they were working with a large number of people, is that they were very committed to the idea that everybody got on the same page when it came to these security protocols. And this is actually a quote from one of the technologists at ICIJ. There's a tendency to have this kind of quick solution where it puts the load of the problem onto staff. Selling long-term technical solutions is a little difficult to the directors, but when you do implement it, it works beautifully, I think, and becomes an example to other organizations. And I just want to share an anecdote from speaking with this person who said, he said something that I found really interesting. And he said, at one point, he said, you know, there was a case in the past where I was given a task and I implemented it in a way that was better, that was more secure than what I was asked to do. And he said, and I would never do that again. And I said, why would you not do that again? And he said, because I didn't tell anyone about it. And what that meant was that I was not only doing more work than I was getting credit for, right? In other words, he was still getting the same tasks assigned to him because people didn't realize he was investing this. He said, but they never appreciated the value that that solution added. And so what was really interesting was to hear somebody on the technology side really committed to this idea that persuading the people that he was working with, persuading the editorial folks about these security measures was a key part of his job. And I thought that I would never do it again was really, really remarkable. So just in summary, we worked really closely with ICIJ to understand the systems and processes that they use to achieve and support an adoption for strong security protocols throughout the Panama Papers project. And we think the key features in this was that they built security buy-in and resource dedication from both the editorial and the technology personnel. They actively engaged with users to ensure that the secured systems were as useful as possible, right? So one of the things we talk about in the paper is the technology acceptance model, which basically says we have two levers for adoption. We have usability and we have utility. And you have to make sure that those things are in balance. They also normalized secure and flexible defaults that had applicability beyond the immediate project, right? So the fact that you needed PGP in order to get your system credentials means that you now know how to use PGP to send an email to a colleague, right? So there's times when you don't need the iHub or whatever it is, you actually have something that can extend to the rest of your work. There's an ancillary benefit, kind of a halo effect there. And finally, seeking professional security advice, I think, is a clear indicator from this, but also treating security as an ongoing effort. As I said, they are still developing systems. They're still evolving their systems. I'll also just put the flag up here that they are also looking to hire a developer for one of those systems. So I'd be happy to talk with anyone about that. And we just want to say a quick thanks to the organizations and individuals that were hugely supportive in this work. Obviously, ICIJ editors and particularly the data team. All of the Panama Papers journalists and survey participants. This work was also supported by the NSF. And although this work was not specifically reviewed by them, the whole project has really benefited from the advice of our advisory board. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And a reminder to the speakers to state their name and affiliation.
Hi, Ian Goldberg, University of Waterloo. Thanks for your talk. It's a really interesting case study. One thing that kind of jumped out at me was the requirement that the URL remain secret, and that coupled with the fact that they're using HTTPS, and so they would have had to have obtained a certificate for that URL. And we're seeing more and more that these certificates get published to certificate transparency logs. And so now anyone who watches those logs, and they're just these websites that just have a list of all the certificates that get issued, and so all the secret, like it's much harder now to keep a URL secret. And I know there are some right now academic proposals to at least make subdomains secret in certificate transparency logs, but what do you think? These people, like, were they aware of this problem? Do you think this will be a problem going forward?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't know, to be honest with you, whether they were concerned about the idea. My guess is that they were not so concerned that people would be like, oh, they got an HTTPS certificate for something. It was a hosted, it was an Amazon solution. They actually were hosting this at Amazon, AWS, in part because they felt that actually the contract that Amazon was willing to provide them about the security of their data and notification was adequate. Also, I would say that at this point, this is no longer true. ICIJ was actually a sub-organization, and so I'm not sure what the identifiers would have been on that certificate. But also just to say that the idea that they would be setting up an HTTPS thing, that they would have a system like this in itself is not. I don't think is necessarily a flag, because they've done similar weak investigations in the past. It was more about not making it obvious to potential attackers that something was going on. But I don't actually know what the answer is to that.
Thanks.
Konstantin Beznosov, UBC. I just want to comment on Ian's question. Maybe they use self-signed certificates, actually.
Yeah, they might have. I don't know. It's a very good question, though.
Yeah, so my question is more about the rating of the usability of the security as high. I was wondering if awareness of the security risks was a factor that influenced the rating of usability of security technology, because they always wanted to be on the safe side.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because we don't really have that, it's not sort of a controlled experiment in that way, but I think absolutely yes, right? I mean, and I think this is something that we heard from the keynote speaker yesterday as well, which is when people understand the risks that they're mitigating through these security protocols, and they feel that those are important risks to reduce, there is less of kind of a psychological barrier to adoption, and so they're much less likely, I think, to feel frustrated by these things because they see the point. I mean, I think ultimately, we can all probably acknowledge that there are a lot of software systems where users are being asked to do things and no one really explains why. And so when you do explain why, I think that has a huge impact on the perceived usability, which is in effect the usability, right?
Alex Rudis, Google. So you emphasized that the security of the site was important, perhaps to quantify that. After publication, was there an increase in intrusion attempts to your infrastructure, and how did the infrastructure handle that?
That's actually a great way to bring up. So there were only two known security incidents up to this point in the project, and they were both cases where the URL of one of the systems was accidentally revealed, and it was somebody was showing a screenshot of something and it contained a URL. And basically, what happened was the second that happened, they shut it down and they moved it. And so their response has basically just been to watch out for those incidents and continue to move the system where necessary.
Thanks.
So, yeah.
Adrienne Porterfeld, Google. Do you think that publishing their operations details will make it harder for them to pull this off again? I wonder if some of the success was because no one at the time was looking, and now people are looking.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Obviously, anytime you're working with a real-world situation, I don't think it will. I don't think it will overall. What I can say is that this system is one that they used here. It's not the exact same system they've used in other leak investigations, and so I think just as Aaron Clark talked about yesterday, depending on the circumstance, you're going to make different choices. And so what I can say is I think they've continued to develop systems that are even more robust in terms of protecting their communications and making it easy to comply with that. But what I would say is that while people might be on the lookout, there's no guarantee or perhaps even likelihood that it would look this way the next time around. Yeah.
Hi, Susan. Tariq Elahi, KU Leuven. So I was just wondering, you mentioned how people were willing to go through a lot of effort to do the necessary security things, right? How much of this do you think is because they knew this was a very high-stakes project?
So how much of their willingness to use it was because it was a very high-stakes project?
Versus, like, say, today where it's just like everyday, ordinary stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that they knew that the stakes were high. I would also emphasize that the stakes were high in multiple ways. So the stakes were high not just because, these were leaked documents and they had to protect them and they're a really big player. Actually, journalists investigate, politicians and corporations all the time, right? So that's actually not so unusual. I think what was very interesting is that although this was not a homogeneous group of individuals in the way that we might traditionally think about it, investigative journalism is a very close-knit community. And basically, I think it's a little bit what I've understood of like working in the government, which is like once you're burned, you're burned. And so because reputation is really important both internally and externally, yes, that's definitely a thing. There were people who were brought in who were not original ICIJ members, which is how they got to that sort of 400 number. And I think that some of the folks we talked to said that it was a challenge in that case, right? When you started to get a degree or two away and kind of explaining to people like, yes, we have to encrypt every email that we send about this thing. So absolutely, I think the stakes matter. But I would also say that what I find interesting about this is the fact that you do have this kind of, we get this sentiment from people that this isn't so bad, and basically that it's not so bad, right? And that I think once that kind of turnover has happened for them, it makes it much more likely that it's something they're going to apply in the rest of their lives. Because why not? And I can say definitely, like I've spoken with people from that, and they're just like, yeah, I do this stuff now all the time. They start their projects now with like a security plan. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's thank all the speakers.